My name is Mackenzie Walker. I am 35 years old. On Tuesday at 11:15 in the morning, I sat in the front pew of St. Jude's Episcopal Church, staring at the closed mahogany casket of my mother-in-law, Evelyn. My husband of 8 years, David, sat beside me. He is a regional commercial real estate developer. He wore a dark suit, his head bowed, playing the role of the grieving son to perfection. The priest had just finished a sentence about Evelyn's unwavering devotion to family truth. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave groaned open. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Footsteps clicked against the stone floor, rapid and uneven. A woman stepped into the center aisle. She wore a wrinkled navy wrap dress. She gripped the hands of 2 children, a little girl in a faded yellow cardigan and a boy in a stiff white button-down shirt. She bypassed the ushers. She marched straight toward the reserved family section. The congregation held its collective breath. You could hear the rustle of paper programs freezing in midair. She stopped directly across the aisle from us. She leaned over the wooden pew to confront David's sister, Jessica. Her whisper was intended to be private, but in the cavernous silence of the church, the acoustics carried every syllable. "I am Sarah," the woman choked out. Her voice shook with unfiltered desperation. "David's other wife. We are being evicted. Evelyn promised us the money. She promised." I turned my head slowly to look at my husband. David stopped breathing. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, tracking down his jawline. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at the children. He kept his eyes fixed on his custom Italian Oxfords. He was a man hoping the floorboards would open and swallow him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I looked at the little boy holding Sarah's right hand. I analyzed his height, his facial structure, the missing front tooth. He was 7, maybe 7.5. My mind processed the data point with clinical efficiency. David and I celebrated our 8th wedding anniversary 2 months ago. If this child was 7, this was not a temporary lapse in judgment during a business trip. My entire marriage was a structural cover story. I was the primary investor in a fraudulent enterprise. What happened in the moments after that realization is the reason I am telling you this story. Welcome back to Revenge Order. This is the channel where family secrets are dragged into the light and the quietest person in the room dismantles the loudest. How old are you? And have you ever realized your entire life was a lie built to protect someone else? Drop your age and your answer in the comments. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss an audit. I am a director of corporate risk management for a global logistics firm in Newark. My job is to identify catastrophic liabilities and mitigate them. I do not act on emotion. I act on documentation. Sitting in that church, the scent of white lilies heavy in the air, I reached into my leather purse. My fingertips found the cool, grooved metal of my limited edition Cartier pen. I gripped it. The metal grounded me. The grief that had sat in my chest all morning evaporated. Across the aisle, Jessica recoiled, her face drained of color. She did not look confused. She looked terrified of being caught. She stood up quickly, grabbing Sarah by the elbow. She ushered the weeping woman and the bewildered children toward the rectory side door. She cast one panicked glance in my direction before disappearing behind the wood paneling. The priest cleared his throat, attempting to resume the service. The murmur of 50 guests started to swell like a rising tide. David finally lifted his head. He reached out to touch my hand. His palm was clammy. His fingers shook. "Mac," he whispered, "I can explain." I pulled my hand away, folding it neatly over my purse. I kept my eyes focused on the altar. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. "Do not speak to me," I said. He swallowed hard, shrinking back into the oak pew. The liability was identified in broad daylight. The audit had officially begun. 1:30 in the afternoon. The Morris County Country Club dining room smelled of wilted floral arrangements, roasted chicken, and the heavy musk of expensive stale perfume. The post-funeral repast is designed to be a theater of manners, a place where people trade hushed condolences over lukewarm coffee. Today, it was a crime scene. I stood near the arched mahogany entrance holding a porcelain plate with a single untouched cucumber sandwich. I scanned the room for my husband. The Walkers pride themselves on keeping up appearances. They are a family that values a polished surface above a solid foundation. They are old New Jersey money, or at least they pretend to be, coasting on the reputation of previous generations. I found David wedged into a corner booth flanked by his 80-year-old great-aunts. He kept his head ducked, nodding at whatever lengthy story Aunt Beatrice was recounting. He was using frail women as a physical barricade. It was a tactical retreat born of sheer cowardice. He knew I would not cause a scene in front of the grieving matriarchs. He thought he could buy time. He thought time would dilute the threat. My eyes tracked away from his table, scanning the perimeter of the dining hall. I located Jessica. She stood alone by the catering station along the far wall. She held a heavy silver coffee urn, staring blankly at the dark liquid pooling in a ceramic cup. Jessica and I never shared a warm relationship. She was a woman who floated on the currents of her family's wealth, working part-time at a boutique public relations firm, avoiding hard metrics and difficult conversations. Right now, she was the weakest link in the chain. I set my plate down on a passing waiter's tray. The clink of the porcelain went unnoticed over the hum of conversations. I walked across the patterned carpet. My posture remained perfectly straight. I did not hurry. Panic moves fast. Authority takes its time. I stepped up beside her. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over hers on the handle of the coffee urn. Her skin was ice-cold, clammy with nervous sweat. She flinched, splashing a few drops of hot coffee onto the starched white tablecloth. "How long has Evelyn been funding the Hartford expansion?" I asked. My voice was pitched low, a steady hum, audible only to her. Jessica's breath hitched in her throat. She looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped bird, terrified someone might overhear the fracture in her family's pristine image. She tried to pull her hand away, but I kept my grip locked, anchoring her to the station. "Mac, please," she whispered, her voice wavering. "This is not the place." "A church was apparently the place," I replied smoothly, "so this will do fine. Give me a timeline, Jessica." Jessica crumpled. Her shoulders caved inward. The polished facade of the Walker family daughter shattered over a tray of assorted pastries. "Evelyn only found out 2 years ago," she stammered. Her eyes refused to meet mine, fixing instead on the coffee stain spreading across the linen. She noticed David was pulling cash from his savings. She confronted him. He broke down and told her about Sarah, about the kids. I waited. Silence is a powerful interrogation tool. It forces guilty people to fill the void. Jessica filled it quickly, desperate to justify the deception. She did not want to break up your marriage, Mac. She really did not. But the kids, Evelyn just loved her secret grandchildren. She said they were innocent in all this. She just wanted to make sure they were taken care of. She did not want them to suffer because David made a mistake. Secret grandchildren. I repeated the phrase in my head. I logged it as a primary data point in my mental ledger. In the corporate risk sector, we classify this specific behavior as systemic rot. When an employee steals, it is individual theft. When the board of directors discovers the theft and conceals it to protect the company image, it becomes a criminal conspiracy. The Walker family viewed me not as an equal member, but as a host organism. I provided the pristine social cover, the dual income stability, the respectable New Jersey address. They extracted those benefits while running a shadow operation, an alternate reality funded by my complacency. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but a sharp, sustained vibration pulsed against my hip. My phone was in the pocket of my charcoal blazer. I released Jessica's hand. I retrieved the device, holding it up to the ambient light of the dining room. The screen illuminated with a push notification from our joint banking portal. I swiped upward with my thumb to open the alert. It was an automated transaction receipt. A routine wire transfer of $4,200 had just cleared. The recipient entity was listed as Harbor Holdings, LLC. For the past 4 years, that exact dollar amount drafted from our accounts on the 15th of every month. David builds and manages commercial properties. He routinely sets up pass-through LLCs to manage operational costs and shield liability. It is a standard industry practice. 4 years ago, he told me Harbor Holdings was a property management vehicle for a retail strip in Connecticut. He said the $4,200 covered routine maintenance, landscaping, exterior lighting, repairs, and snow removal contracts. I am a busy professional. I review our macro financial dashboards quarterly, but I trusted my husband with the granular real estate operating expenses. I assumed the numbers were honest. Trust, I realized in that moment, is the ultimate vulnerability. I looked from the glowing glass screen to Jessica's tear-streaked face. Harbor Holdings. Sarah and the children lived somewhere. They required housing, groceries, electricity, and health insurance. 2 years ago, Evelyn found out David was draining his personal savings to afford his dual life. Evelyn stepped in to help. But Evelyn was a retired school administrator living on a fixed pension. She could not float a second household alone. The math aligned perfectly, the pieces dropping into place like the heavy steel tumblers of a bank vault lock. The $4,200 was not a landscaping fee. It was disguised alimony. It was a mortgage payment. My pulse slowed down. A chilling, pristine calm settled over my nervous system, replacing the adrenaline with cold logic. David was not merely cheating on me. He was actively embezzling my corporate salary to subsidize his mistress. Every time I negotiated a raise at the logistics firm, every time I worked a grueling 60-hour week auditing global supply chains, I was directly increasing the standard of living for a woman named Sarah. The Walkers were not just hiding a second family. They were outsourcing the financial burden of it to me. Jessica sniffled, wiping her nose with a cocktail napkin. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for me to scream, to break down, to act like a betrayed wife seeking comfort. "Mac," she whispered, reaching out a hand, "we can fix this. David loves you. We are your family." I slipped the phone back into my blazer pocket. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her grace. I looked at her with the same detached assessment I reserve for vendors who breach their contract terms. "Enjoy the reception, Jessica," I said. I turned my back on the catering station. I walked past the round tables draped in white linen. I walked past the corner booth where David was still hiding behind his great aunts. He caught my eye as I passed. He half stood, his mouth forming my name, but I did not break my stride. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club lobby. The afternoon air was crisp, biting against my skin. The sun reflected off the rows of luxury sedans in the parking lot. The gravel crunched beneath my heels. The sound was rhythmic, steady, purposeful. I reached my Audi. I unlocked the door. I slid into the driver's seat. The leather interior was cool, smelling faintly of cedar. I gripped the steering wheel, staring out through the windshield. I was no longer a grieving daughter-in-law. I was a senior investigator, and a systemic fraud had been committed using my capital. The funeral was over. The extraction phase had begun. I started the engine and drove toward the house, preparing to pull the financial records, before David realized the game had changed. 2:45 in the afternoon. I pulled my Audi into the driveway of our home in Morris County. The structure was a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial with a manicured front lawn and a 3-car garage. It was a monument to our dual income stability, a brick and mortar testament to what I believed was a successful partnership. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with identical houses housing identical executives. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence for a fraction of a second. I let the scent of the leather interior ground me. Then I grabbed my purse, unlocked the front door, and bypassed the vaulted living room entirely. I walked straight down the hallway to my home office. I stepped inside. I closed the solid oak door behind me and turned the brass deadbolt. The lock engaged with a heavy, satisfying click. My workspace is designed for efficiency. 3 curved monitors sit atop a motorized standing desk. A shredder rests in the corner. File cabinets line the left wall, housing 7 years of tax returns, mortgage documents, and insurance policies. When I manage global supply chain risks, I track freighters across oceans and audit vendors in foreign ports. I hunt for missing inventory on a macro scale. Today, the missing inventory was my husband. I woke up my workstation. The monitors flared to life, bathing the dark room in a sharp blue glow. I opened my encrypted password manager. I did not start with the banking portals. In logistics, if you want to find the leak, you track the physical movement of the asset. David was the asset. I logged into our shared EZ-Pass toll account. David claimed to be developing commercial retail spaces in the Hartford market. He used that excuse to justify leaving every Tuesday morning and returning late Thursday night. He told me the commute was brutal, the hotel beds were stiff, and the local zoning boards were relentless. I opened his shared Google Calendar on my left monitor. I highlighted every trip labeled Hartford Site Inspection over the past 36 months. On my center monitor, I pulled the corresponding toll plaza transaction logs from the Transit Authority database. I cross-referenced the dates. I traced the digital breadcrumbs of his silver sedan. The transponder pinged at the George Washington Bridge, moving onto Interstate 95 northbound. The timestamps matched his departure schedule perfectly. But as my eyes scrolled down the rows of data, a geographic anomaly emerged. The pings did not continue into central Connecticut. They never reached Hartford. Every single Tuesday, the toll charges terminated at exit 8, Stamford. Every single Thursday, the return trip originated from that exact same Stamford Plaza. He was stopping 40 miles short of his stated destination. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, the harsh light reflecting in my eyes. A man does not drive to Stamford 3 days a week to sleep in a Marriott. The $4,200 monthly draft to Harbor Holdings, LLC, was not a property management fee for a strip mall. It was a domestic operating budget. He was paying a residential mortgage. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. I exhaled a slow, measured breath. The physical artifacts were undeniable smoking guns. The baseline of the deception was established. But a cold, sharp question crept into my mind. I am a director of risk management. I am paid a very high salary to detect financial anomalies before they compromise corporate infrastructure. How did I miss a structural deficit inside my own marriage for 7 years? The $4,200 monthly wire was clever. It was small enough to blend into the operational noise of our high net worth lifestyle. But purchasing a secondary home in a wealthy Connecticut suburb requires a substantial down payment. A second family requires capital expenditure. Where did the principal come from? I opened a new browser tab. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and logged directly into our long-term wealth management portfolios. We maintained a diversified strategy, high-yield savings municipal bonds, and a series of Vanguard accounts. I began exporting the annual statements, sorting the spreadsheets by transfer volume. I was looking for the bleed. I scrolled past the standard market fluctuations, ignoring the mutual fund dividends. I went back 4 years. Then I found it, a PDF attachment labeled Blind Trust Allocation. I downloaded the file and opened it on my right monitor. It was a formal legal instrument dense with tax codes and fiduciary jargon. The document authorized the transfer of $140,000 from my primary equity shares into a restricted third-party managed index fund. At the time, David told me this was a high-yield tax shelter designed to protect our assets from his commercial real estate liabilities. I had trusted the advice because it did not come from David. The author of the document was listed on the bottom left corner of the first page, Thomas Walker. David's father is a retired tax attorney. Thomas is a man who walks into country clubs like he owns the fairway. He built his career shielding wealthy clients from federal audits. He wears bespoke suits, drinks expensive scotch, and positions himself as the moral patriarch of his family. He drafted this document under the guise of paternal financial protection. I scrolled to the final page of the PDF to examine the authorization signatures. Thomas had signed as the managing agent. David had signed as the primary account holder. And there, on the bottom right line, was my signature. I stared at my name written in digital ink. I leaned forward, my nose inches from the glass screen. I held down the control key and scrolled my mouse wheel, magnifying the document to 400%. The pixels enlarged, revealing the exact flow of the ink. It was perfect. The loop of the M, the sharp angle of the K, the trailing tail of the final letter. It was structurally flawless. That was the problem. It was too perfect. When people sign routine financial disclosures, they rush. The lines are thin, hurried, often trailing off under the pressure of a cheap ballpoint pen. This signature was deliberate. The ink was thick, pooling slightly at the bottom of the downward strokes, indicating a heavy, continuous pressure. It was the distinct mark of a medium nib rollerball, flowing with expensive blue-black ink. My hand drifted toward my leather purse resting on the corner of the desk. I unclasped the brass hardware and reached inside. My fingers closed around the cold, grooved metal of my limited edition Cartier pen. Thomas gifted me this exact pen 5 years ago when I was promoted to director. He handed it to me in a velvet box, smiling warmly, telling me that a serious executive needs a serious signature. I kept it in my purse for special occasions. I rarely used it for mundane household paperwork. I certainly never used it to sign a blind trust allocation document late on a Tuesday evening 4 years ago. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Thomas did not just offer bad financial advice. He requested a copy of my signature from David. He sat at his mahogany desk, unscrewed the cap of a replica Cartier pen, and deliberately forged my name on a binding legal document. He engineered the blind spot. He built the legal wall that allowed his son to siphon $140,000 of my money to purchase the Stanford house for the mistress. The scope of the threat expanded exponentially. I was not dealing with a weak, cheating husband. I was dealing with a coordinated, highly educated family syndicate. The father-in-law committed felony wire fraud and forgery to subsidize his son's adultery. They weaponized my trust, using my own career milestones against me. I did not feel heartbreak. Heartbreak is a useless emotion reserved for people who do not know how to fight back. I felt a profound, dangerous focus. I began downloading every page, every timestamp, every IP address linked to the trust document. I routed the files into a partitioned, encrypted hard drive. I built the evidence vault. Outside the window, the low rumble of a German engine broke the suburban quiet. I turned my head. Through the wooden blinds, I watched David's silver sedan pull into the driveway. He parked haphazardly, the front tire resting on the edge of the manicured grass. He killed the engine and stepped out of the car. His tie was loosened. His suit jacket hung over his arm. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, looking at the front door like a man walking toward an execution block. He was coming inside to deploy the emotional manipulation script. He was going to drop to his knees, shed rehearsed tears, and spin a web of desperate lies about a momentary mistake. He thought he was walking into a house containing a shattered, weeping wife. He had no idea he was walking into an active federal audit. I minimized the windows on my monitors. I locked the screen. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal skirt, and waited for the sound of his key in the front door. The brass handle of my office door rattled. The lock held firm, a solid barrier between my quiet sanctuary and the approaching storm. A brief stretch of silence followed. I heard the faint jingle of metal from the hallway. David was retrieving the emergency key from the top drawer of the hallway console. He slid the jagged brass into the pin tumbler. The deadbolt disengaged with a dull thud. The heavy oak door swung inward. David stood on the threshold. He had discarded his suit jacket somewhere in the foyer. His silk tie was gone. The top 2 buttons of his tailored dress shirt were undone, exposing his collarbone. He looked disheveled, but it was a calculated dishevelment. David built his real estate career on his ability to read a room and mirror the required emotions. He knew how to play the victim, the martyr, the overburdened provider. He was stepping onto a stage preparing to deliver the performance of his life. He walked toward me, his shoulders slumped. He closed the distance between us and dropped heavily onto his knees right beside my ergonomic chair. He reached out and grabbed both of my hands. His grip was tight, urgent. He buried his face against my knuckles. A ragged sob tore through his chest. "Mac, I am so sorry," he choked out, his voice muffled against my skin. "It was a mistake. It happened so long ago. I was terrified. Evelyn made me keep it a secret. She said it would destroy you, destroy us. I did not want to lose you. I love you." I looked down at the top of his head. I felt the moisture of his tears dampening the back of my hand. I did not pull away immediately. I sat in my chair and observed him with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a predictable chemical reaction. When humans experience genuine, unfiltered panic, their physiology betrays them. Their breathing becomes erratic. Their vocal cords tighten, raising the pitch of their voice. Their tears mix with mucus. David possessed none of these symptoms. His breathing was remarkably rhythmic beneath the theatrics. He was reciting a script he had likely rehearsed on the drive home from the country club. He was attempting to shift the blame to a woman who was currently resting inside a closed mahogany casket. Blaming a dead mother is the ultimate defensive strategy for a coward. He expected me to rip my hands away. He expected me to scream, to throw the heavy crystal paperweight sitting on my desk, to demand details about Sarah and her physical appearance. He was prepared to weather a hurricane of female hysteria. I did not give him a hurricane. I gave him a vacuum. I smoothly extracted my hands from his grip. I rested my palms flat on the glass surface of my desk. I leaned forward slightly, forcing him to look up at my face. His eyes were red, but they were alert, searching my expression for a crack in the armor. "Is Harbor Holdings an S-Corp or a pass-through LLC?" I asked. My voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. It was the exact tone I use when questioning a supply chain vendor about a missing shipping manifest. The question hit him like a physical blow. The manufactured tears vanished, instantly evaporating from his eyes. His jaw went slack. The emotional script he was relying on crashed into a concrete wall. He was prepared to beg for forgiveness regarding a mistress. He was entirely unprepared to be interrogated about a clandestine corporate entity. How he whispered. The word barely escaped his throat. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed him. He realized in that fraction of a second that I was not focusing on the woman who interrupted the funeral. I was focusing on the financial architecture that sustained her. Before he could formulate a lie, a harsh, rapid vibration shattered the tension in the room. The sound emanated from his right trouser pocket. His phone was buzzing. It did not stop after a single notification. It buzzed in a relentless, frantic rhythm. The cadence of the vibration told a clear story. Someone was sending multiple text messages in rapid succession, followed immediately by an incoming call. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that cellular signal. Sarah was sitting in a house in Stamford holding an eviction notice, realizing the man who promised her a permanent safety net was currently out of funds and out of excuses. The secondary liability was panicking. "Place your iPhone and your work laptop on the desk," I said. David blinked, breaking his stare. He instinctively pressed his hand against his right pocket, shielding the vibrating device through the fabric of his trousers. What he stammered, his voice cracking, "Why, consider it a voluntary audit," I replied. "If Evelyn truly orchestrated this entire deception and you are merely a victim of her manipulation, your digital correspondence will corroborate your story. Surrender the devices. Let us verify the data." The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He scrambled backward, breaking contact with my desk. He pushed himself up from his knees, stumbling slightly on the thick carpet. His protective instinct kicked into high gear, but it was not aimed at protecting our marriage. He was protecting his operational security. "I cannot do that, Mac," he said, his breathing finally becoming genuinely erratic. "I have sensitive client information on those devices, non-disclosure agreements. You are invading my privacy. We need to talk about this like adults, not like adversaries." Privacy. The irony of the word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A man who spent 7 years funding a shadow family using forged signatures was now invoking his right to digital privacy. His refusal was the final confirmation I required. An innocent man hands over his phone. A guilty man clings to it like a life raft. I nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. I did not argue. I did not repeat my demand. "Sleep in the guest room tonight, David," I said. "Do not come out until morning." The cold dismissal broke his remaining resolve. He wanted an argument. An argument implies a negotiation, a chance to win back lost ground. I offered him nothing but an exile. He stared at me for a long moment, clutching his pocket. Then he turned and walked out of the office. He pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, fading until the house fell into a tense, heavy silence. I reached forward and turned the brass lock on my door, securing the perimeter once again. Then I sat back down in my ergonomic chair. I woke my computer monitors. I did not need his physical iPhone. I did not need his work laptop. David was a real estate developer. He understood zoning laws and building permits. He did not understand network architecture. When you connect a device to a home Wi-Fi network, that device broadcasts every single action through the primary router. I opened a secure terminal window on my center monitor. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I entered the administrative credentials for our home network gateway. The interface loaded, displaying a real-time map of every connected device in the house. I quickly identified the MAC address corresponding to David's smartphone. I launched a packet-sniffing protocol. Lines of green text began cascading down the black screen. I was not intercepting the actual text of his messages. Modern encryption prevents a simple reading of the contents. But in risk management, the metadata is often more valuable than the message itself. I watched the telemetry data flow across the monitor. I tracked the destination IP addresses. David was ignoring Sarah's frantic calls. Instead, his device was executing multiple rapid encrypted handshakes with a secure messaging server. I cross-referenced the destination routing. He was not texting his mistress. He was messaging his father. The data packets spiked, indicating a high volume of outbound traffic. David was sitting on the edge of the guest room bed, frantically typing out a warning to Thomas Walker. The son was alerting the patriarch that the firewall had been breached. The syndicate was communicating, scrambling to assess the damage and prepare a counteroffensive. I leaned back, watching the data stream illuminate the dark office. The father and son believed they still had the upper hand. They believed the forged blind trust document was an impenetrable legal shield. They had no idea I already possessed the toll logs, the financial transfers, and the structural proof of their forgery. They were preparing for a divorce settlement. They did not realize I was preparing a corporate dissolution. My phone illuminated on the corner of the desk. A new email arrived in my secure inbox. I shifted my attention away from the router telemetry. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the subject line. The sender was a state registry database. The contents of that email contained a specific real estate closing document from Stamford, Connecticut, revealing a name that would force me to update my entire threat matrix. The deception was about to expand beyond my husband and his father. The harsh blue light from the monitors washed over my face, illuminating the quiet space of my home office. It was 3:15 in the morning. The house was dead silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the central heating unit. David remained exiled in the guest room at the end of the hallway. The telemetry data on my screen showed his phone had finally stopped broadcasting encrypted packets to his father an hour ago. The syndicate was sleeping. I was not. I took a sip of black coffee from a ceramic mug. The liquid was lukewarm and bitter, but it served its purpose. It kept my mind razor sharp. I clicked on the email notification that had just arrived from the Connecticut State Registry database. When auditing a fraudulent entity, you start with the money, but you finish with the paperwork. Money can be laundered, rerouted, and disguised through shell companies. Paperwork leaves a permanent, notarized footprint. I had already identified Harbor Holdings, LLC, as the primary vehicle for David's embezzlement. Now I needed to dismantle the vehicle itself. I downloaded the attached PDF file. It was the official Articles of Organization for Harbor Holdings filed 4 years prior. I scrolled past the standard liability clauses and operating agreements, hunting for the signature of the registered agent. The name printed at the bottom of the document confirmed my suspicions, linking the forged blind trust document directly to the real estate shell company. Thomas Walker. The patriarch was not just offering bad financial advice from the sidelines. He was the legal architect of the entire operation. He drafted the LLC paperwork, registered the entity, and provided the structural shielding necessary to purchase the Stamford property without triggering a marital asset flag. The rot did not stop at my husband. It went straight to the foundation of the family tree. I opened a new tab and accessed the municipal property records for Fairfield County. I inputted the address associated with Harbor Holdings. I wanted to see the physical asset my stolen salary was maintaining. The database generated a copy of the original property deed and the accompanying closing disclosure forms from 4 years ago. I skimmed the first page, noting the purchase price and the substantial down payment. My eyes drifted to the second page, scanning the itemized breakdown of closing costs, title insurance fees, and broker commissions. My gaze locked onto a single line item midway down the page. The text seemed to vibrate against the white background. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. My hand hovered over the mouse. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the name listed under the buying agent designation, Jessica Walker. I read the name a second time, then a third. The cognitive gears in my mind shifted, reevaluating every interaction I had experienced over the past 48 hours. I flashed back to the country club repast just hours earlier. Jessica standing by the catering station, her hands shaking, splashing hot coffee onto the linen tablecloth. Jessica crying, her voice wavering, swearing that their mother Evelyn only found out about the mistress 2 years ago. Jessica playing the role of the terrified, innocent bystander, begging me to understand that Evelyn just wanted to protect her secret grandchildren. It was a performance. It was a calculated, brilliant performance designed to manipulate my empathy. Jessica was not a bystander. Jessica was a licensed real estate broker operating out of a boutique agency in Morristown. 4 years ago, she acted as the official buying agent for Harbor Holdings, LLC. She found the Stamford house. She drafted the purchase agreement. She facilitated the transaction that provided a roof for her brother's mistress. I looked at the column adjacent to her name. The document detailed her exact compensation for the transaction. A standard 3% broker commission, $22,000. My breathing slowed. The silence in my office felt heavy, charged with a sudden, lethal clarity. Jessica did not just know about Sarah. She actively profited from her existence. Jessica pocketed a $22,000 commission check, funded entirely by the down payment her father and brother stole from my savings. The tears at the funeral reception were not tears of shock or grief. They were a sophisticated red herring. She wept to portray herself as a victim of David's deception, hoping to secure my complacency, hoping I would view her as an ally rather than an accomplice. The entire Walker family structure collapsed, in my mind, rebuilding itself into something entirely different. They were not a dysfunctional family struggling with a wayward son. They were a corporate syndicate. Evelyn, the matriarch, acted as the bank, utilizing her pension to float the mistress's monthly expenses when David ran out of liquid cash. Thomas, the patriarch, acted as the legal counsel, forging signatures and constructing the LLC to shield the assets. Jessica, the sister, acted as the procurement officer, securing the physical property and extracting a profit from the transaction. And David, my husband, was the field operative, managing the dual logistics and funneling the stolen capital. I was not their family member. I was their primary revenue stream. I was a high-earning logistics executive who worked grueling hours to maintain their country club memberships, their imported cars, and their pristine social standing. They fed off my labor, a synchronized parasitic ecosystem designed to extract my wealth while keeping me blind to the extraction. I sat back in my chair. A profound, icy detachment settled into my bones. The parameters of my objective shifted permanently. Divorcing David was no longer the primary goal. Simply walking away and splitting our remaining assets in a sterile mediation room would be a failure of risk management. It would leave the syndicate intact, allowing them to regroup and find a new host organism. You do not just fire an embezzling employee. You audit their entire department, seize their assets, and ensure they can never operate in your industry again. I needed to dismantle the Walker family's financial ecosystem brick by brick. I needed to expose Thomas to the State Bar Association. I needed to ensure Jessica's broker license was revoked. I needed to bankrupt David so thoroughly that his commercial real estate firm would consider him a liability. I reached for the blue manila folder resting on the corner of my desk. I opened it and placed the printed Easy Pass logs, the forged blind trust document, and the LLC registry inside. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The printer hummed to life, spitting out the Stamford property deed bearing Jessica's name and her $22,000 commission payout. I took the warm paper hole-punched the margin and added it to the folder. The evidence vault was growing. The narrative was solidifying. But data is only dangerous when it is weaponized correctly. I needed to understand exactly how the syndicate acquired the initial capital to fund the Stamford purchase. I needed to trace the specific origin of the down payment. I closed the municipal database and opened my personal corporate payroll portal. I navigated to my historical compensation records, searching for a specific date 4 years prior, the date Thomas forged my signature on the blind trust. I was looking for a catalyst, a large influx of capital that would prompt the syndicate to execute their real estate maneuver. I found the payroll stub. The numbers on the screen triggered a visceral, physical reaction. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid, contrasting violently with the cold reality of the documents spread across my desk. The origin of the stolen money was not just a financial transfer. It was a memory poisoned by dramatic irony, a toast to a future that never existed. I stared at the screen, preparing to trace the exact path of the largest bonus I had ever earned. The screen of my center monitor displayed my historical corporate compensation records. I scrolled past years of biweekly direct deposits, my eyes hunting for a specific transaction date. I navigated to October 14th, 3 years prior. The digital payroll stub loaded against the white background of the portal. Gross compensation, $150,000. In the logistics sector, performance bonuses of that magnitude are not handed out for standard quarterly growth. They are earned through grueling, relentless crisis management. 3 years ago, a major overseas shipping conglomerate filed for unexpected bankruptcy. Hundreds of freighters were stranded in international waters, loaded with millions of dollars of our client inventory. Supply chains froze overnight. I spent 4 months untangling that geopolitical nightmare. I worked 70-hour weeks. I negotiated with port authorities in 3 different time zones, surviving on lukewarm break-room coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night. My hair thinned. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath my eyes. I pushed my physical and mental endurance to the absolute limit to protect my firm from a catastrophic quarterly loss. When the crisis resolved, the executive board authorized the bonus. I deposited the funds into our joint high-yield savings account. I intended to use the capital to remodel our outdated kitchen and bolster our early retirement portfolio. I sat in my dark office, staring at the 6-figure sum on the screen. A visceral memory surfaced, clawing its way through the cold logic I had wrapped around myself. The evening the funds cleared the bank, I arrived home long after sunset. The house was dimly lit, smelling faintly of seared steak and rosemary. I dropped my leather briefcase by the door, exhausted to my marrow. David walked out of the dining room. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He held a green glass bottle of vintage champagne, cold condensation beating along the label. He smiled. It was a warm, crinkling smile that reached the corners of his eyes. He handed me a delicate crystal flute. He popped the cork. The celebratory sound echoed off the high ceiling of the foyer. He poured the pale, effervescent liquid. I remember the chill of the crystal against my fingertips. I remember leaning against the wall, kicking off my heels, feeling a profound sense of shared accomplishment. We were a team. I fought the corporate wars, and he managed the domestic architecture. He raised his glass. The crystal chimed as it struck mine. "To building our future, Mac," he said. "You earned every single penny of this. I am so proud of you." The memory dissolved, snapping me back to the harsh blue glare of my workstation. The dramatic irony hit my chest with the blunt force of a physical blow. While we stood in that foyer drinking expensive champagne, the machinery of my financial execution was already calibrated and waiting to be engaged. The timeline of the documents on my desk overlaid perfectly with the memory in my head. David toasted to our future at 8 o'clock in the evening. 12 hours later, at 8 o'clock the following morning, Thomas Walker submitted the blind trust allocation paperwork to our brokerage firm. The document bore the forged signature created with my own Cartier pen. By noon that same day, $140,000 vanished from the joint savings account. The funds bypassed standard fraud alerts due to the legally binding nature of the trust document drafted by the retired tax attorney. David told me the money was safely locked in a protected, high-yield index fund. He told me it was earning interest for our retirement. I opened the wire transfer history from that week. I traced the routing numbers attached to the destination account. The digital trail did not lead to an index fund. It led to a regional bank in Connecticut, specifically an escrow account managed by a title company in Fairfield County. My grueling 70-hour work weeks did not build our future. My physical exhaustion, my thinning hair, my missed meals, all of it was converted into liquid capital and funneled directly into the Stamford real estate market. My labor literally paid the down payment on the house where Sarah and her 2 children currently slept. The stainless steel appliances in her kitchen, the roof over her head, the manicured lawn where her son played. I funded every single square foot of it. David drank champagne with me, looked me directly in the eyes, and celebrated the windfall he was planning to steal the very next morning. A sharp, acidic wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. The bitter coffee I drank earlier turned sour in my throat. My hands began to tremble, a rare involuntary tremor originating from a place of profound, primal betrayal. The syndicate did not just steal my money. They mocked my work ethic. They turned my ambition into their personal ATM. I closed my eyes. I focused on the steady hum of the computer tower beneath my desk. I inhaled a slow, measured breath through my nose. I held it for 4 seconds. I exhaled through my mouth. I forced the physical reaction down, locking it away in a dark corner of my mind. In corporate risk management, anger is a severe liability. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger compels you to send emotional text messages, to yell, to tip your hand before the trap is fully set. Data, however, is a weapon. Data does not feel. Data simply destroys whatever it is aimed at. I opened my eyes. The tremor in my hands ceased. My pulse returned to a slow, steady resting rate. I highlighted the $150,000 payroll deposit, the forged blind trust document, and the corresponding $140,000 escrow wire transfer. I pressed the print command. The laser printer on the credenza whirred to life. The machine processed the command, spitting out 3 crisp sheets of paper. I stood up from my ergonomic chair. I walked over to the credenza and retrieved the warm documents. I carried them back to the desk. I picked up the pristine blue manila folder, opening the cardboard cover. The dossier was growing thick. The Easy Pass toll logs, the LLC registry bearing the patriarch's name, the property deed listing the sisters' broker commission, and now the exact financial autopsy of the stolen bonus. I lined the edges of the paper, tapping them against the glass surface of my desk. I placed the new evidence inside the folder and closed the cover. I ran my hand over the smooth blue cardboard. The narrative was nearly complete. I needed one final piece of leverage. I needed to understand the current operational status of the Stamford property. If David and his father stole my bonus 4 years ago to purchase the house, Why was Sarah interrupting a funeral today, weeping about a pending eviction? A sudden sharp noise shattered the quiet of the office. My phone, resting face up next to the keyboard, vibrated violently against the glass desktop. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh white light into the room. I looked down at the caller identification display. The incoming number was not saved in my contacts, but the geographic origin was clearly visible in bold black letters beneath the 10 digits. Stamford, Connecticut. The secondary liability was calling. I stared at the glowing screen. Sarah was not reaching out to David's device anymore. The son was exiled in the guest room, his phone silenced, his communication restricted to his father. The mistress was out of options, out of money, and desperate enough to bypass the husband and contact the primary host organism directly. I let the device vibrate 3 times. I wanted her anxiety to peak. I wanted her to feel the silence stretching out on the other end of the line. I reached forward, picked up the phone, and pressed the green acceptance icon. I brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. The digital connection hissed with faint static. I held the receiver to my ear, maintaining a steady, disciplined silence. In negotiations, the first person to speak concedes power. I waited for the woman on the other end to break. "I know you are there," a voice snapped. "I can hear you breathing." The tone was brittle, sharp, with a frantic edge. Sarah did not sound like a triumphant mistress calling to claim her territory. She sounded like a cornered animal. "Speak," I commanded. My voice was a flat, unyielding line. "I am not going to let you freeze us out, Mackenzie." She escalated her breath, hitching. "David told me exactly what you are doing. You are holding up the probate. You are refusing to sign the release forms for his trust fund. Evelyn promised that money to my children. They are his true heirs. You need to step aside gracefully and release the estate capital. We have a 48-hour eviction notice taped to our front door." I reached across the glass desktop and pulled a yellow legal pad toward me. I uncapped my Cartier pen. The gold nib glided across the lined paper. I wrote 3 phrases. Trust fund. Estate capital. 48-hour eviction. I stared at the handwritten notes. The architecture of David's deception was complex, but it was built on a foundation of profound structural flaws. I let Sarah continue her tirade, listening as she listed her grievances, her demands, and her perceived entitlements. She spoke of David's vast family wealth, his supposed portfolio of untouchable offshore accounts, and the grand inheritance Evelyn had allegedly secured for her secret grandchildren. I did not interrupt her. I analyzed her vocabulary. A critical blind spot in my threat matrix suddenly illuminated. Sarah was operating under a fabricated reality. She believed she was fighting a jealous wife for control of a sprawling financial empire. She was entirely unaware of the actual balance sheet. David did not possess a trust fund. The Walker family name carried social weight in Morris County, but it did not carry generational liquidity. Thomas Walker spent his career earning a comfortable attorney's salary, not building a dynasty. Furthermore, Evelyn did not leave behind a lucrative estate. My mother-in-law passed away carrying $80,000 in unsecured credit card debt and a reverse mortgage on her primary residence. Sarah was demanding the release of phantom assets. I muted my microphone. While Sarah continued to rant about her children's rightful inheritance, I opened a new browser tab. I accessed the Connecticut Judicial Branch Public Records database. I inputted the Stamford property address registered to Harbor Holdings. The search query returned a lengthy docket history. A standard 48-hour eviction notice is the final step in a very long legal process. It means a bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings, completed the required waiting periods, won the judgment, and purchased the asset back at auction. The docket confirmed my assessment. The Stamford house went into default 14 months ago. The property was sold at a sheriff's auction 3 weeks prior. David had not paid the mortgage in over a year. I unmuted the microphone. Sarah was still talking, her voice growing hoarse. "He promised me." She wept, the anger dissolving into raw panic. "He said the estate transfer was just delayed because of the funeral. He said the lawyers were sorting it out." I do a sharp line through the words trust fund on my legal pad. The mechanics of the shadow operation laid themselves bare on the glowing screen in front of me. David utilized my $140,000 bonus to secure the initial down payment for the Stamford property. But securing a house is only the first step. Maintaining a secondary household requires a continuous stream of substantial revenue: property taxes, utilities, groceries, and childcare. The $4,200 monthly wire transfer I uncovered earlier was insufficient to cover those operating costs in a premium Connecticut suburb. Someone else was funding the deficit. Evelyn was not merely a sympathetic grandmother hiding a secret. Evelyn was the central bank. She utilized her fixed retirement pension to float Sarah's lifestyle, keeping the mistress quiet and compliant. But a year ago, Evelyn fell ill. The medical treatments drained her remaining liquidity. The pension funds were redirected to oncology bills. The shadow bank dried up. When Evelyn stopped paying, the Stamford mortgage fell into default. But David is a commercial real estate developer. A man in his position has access to capital markets. Why would he let his secondary residence face foreclosure? I needed to examine his corporate ledgers. I accessed the county clerk's Uniform Commercial Code filings. I searched for David's flagship business entity. The results populated the screen, revealing a financial crater of terrifying proportions. David was not just failing to pay Sarah's mortgage. He was failing across his entire portfolio. The filings showed 3 separate mezzanine loans executed over the past 18 months. Mezzanine debt is high-risk predatory lending. Developers only utilize hard money lenders when traditional banks refuse to extend their credit lines. David leveraged his firm's commercial strip malls using his primary business assets as collateral to secure short-term, high-interest cash injections. He borrowed from ruthless creditors to keep the illusion alive for his mistress. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme, shuffling debt from one ledger to another, hoping the eventual inheritance from his mother would bail him out. He built his entire survival strategy on the assumption that Evelyn possessed hidden wealth. He lied to Sarah about the trust fund, just as effectively as he lied to me about the Hartford business trips. The man sleeping in my guest room was completely bankrupt. Sarah was not a wealthy, pampered mistress living a life of luxury on my dime. She was a defrauded creditor. She sacrificed 7 years of her youth, bore 2 children, and remained in the shadows for a man who possessed nothing but leveraged debt and a sociopathic talent for deception. She was currently sitting in a foreclosed home, waiting for a sheriff to physically remove her belongings, believing a mythical trust fund would save her. "Hello?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking over the line. "Are you listening to me? Are you going to release the funds?" I looked at the UCC filings. I looked at the foreclosure docket. The power dynamic of the situation inverted entirely. I no longer viewed the woman on the phone as a rival. She was an unsecured liability, and she held a piece of leverage I could repurpose for my own audit. "Thank you for your time, Sarah," I said. My tone was polite, professional, and entirely devoid of malice. "Your perspective has been exceptionally informative." "Wait, what does that mean?" she stammered. "What about the eviction?" I severed the connection. The line went dead. I placed the phone face down on the glass desk. The threat landscape was now fully illuminated. The Walker family was broke. They were drowning in predatory debt and impending foreclosures. The only solvent liquid asset remaining in their entire orbit was me. My corporate salary, my equity shares, and the pristine credit rating I built over a decade of disciplined financial management. They did not just want to keep me quiet. They needed me to survive. I closed the browser tabs, routing the UCC filings and the foreclosure docket into the blue manila folder. I tapped the edges of the thick paper stack against the desk, aligning them perfectly. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front of the house. The sound did not come from the guest room. It came from the heavy oak of the main entryway door. I glanced at the digital clock on my monitor. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. David was still exiled down the hall. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal skirt. I walked out of my office, moving silently across the hardwood floors of the corridor. I reached the foyer and looked through the narrow glass sidelight framing the front door. Thomas Walker stood on my porch. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried a dark leather briefcase. Beside him stood Jessica, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her cashmere coat, looking anxious. The patriarch had arrived to negotiate. He believed he held the winning hand. He was about to discover the house always wins, and I owned the house. I unlocked the brass deadbolt. The heavy door swung inward, revealing the gray afternoon light. Thomas Walker did not wait for an invitation. He stepped across the threshold, his leather Oxfords striking the marble tile of my foyer with heavy, deliberate force. Jessica trailed a few paces behind him, pulling her cashmere coat tighter around her torso. Her eyes darted toward the dark hallway, searching the shadows as if expecting a trap. Thomas spent 4 decades working in corporate litigation. He mastered the art of physical intimidation long before he entered retirement. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that projected unwavering authority. He built his entire career by using his physical presence to shrink the oxygen in a room, forcing opposing counsel into defensive, submissive postures. He assumed the exact same tactic would work on his daughter-in-law. He carried a dark mahogany briefcase. He marched past me and set the leather bag down on the glass console table beneath the foyer mirror. The brass latches snapped open with a sharp, echoing double click. He reached inside, extracted a thick stack of legal-size paper stapled at the top left corner, and placed the document squarely on the glass surface. Mackenzie, he began, lowering his voice to a resonant, patronizing baritone. We are all grieving. David is an emotional wreck. The incident at the church was unfortunate and highly inappropriate, but we need to handle this situation with cold practicality. Hysteria helps no one. I closed the front door. The latch clicked into place, sealing the 3 of us inside the entryway. I did not speak. I simply stood near the doorframe, watching him attempt to control the narrative. That is a post-nuptial asset waiver, Thomas stated, gesturing to the stack of paper. It dissolves the marriage cleanly. No lengthy discovery phase, no drawn-out mediation, no public spectacle in the local papers. I have secured a cashier's check for $100,000. It is yours, free and clear, the moment you sign the final page. You pack your personal belongings, you leave David the house, and you walk away with a fresh start. He smoothed his silk tie, waiting for my reaction. I looked down at the documents. I did not reach for them. My hands remained at my sides. Thomas interpreted my silence as weakness. He leaned closer, resting his knuckles on the console table, pressing his perceived advantage. Do not think about contesting the commercial real estate portfolio, he warned, his tone dropping an octave. Do not even consider hunting for Harbor Holdings or any other subsidiary. The blind trust document you signed shields those entities entirely. You have 0 legal access to his business assets or his development capital. The legal walls are impenetrable. Take the money, Mackenzie. It is the most generous deal you will ever receive. I lowered my gaze to the top sheet of the waiver. The text was standard boilerplate release language, dense with indemnity clauses and non-disclosure agreements. My eyes bypassed the legal jargon, scanning the header format, locking onto the automated timestamp printed in the upper right margin. The date read Monday. Monday was the day prior to Evelyn's funeral. A chilling wave of clarity washed over my senses, sharpening every detail in the room. They drafted this settlement before Sarah ever walked down the center aisle of the church. Evelyn's death severed the mistress's funding. Thomas and Jessica knew the shadow operation was broke. They knew the secondary liability possessed a 48-hour eviction notice. They anticipated the fallout before the casket was even closed. They prepared the severance package in advance, plotting to blindside me during a period of manufactured grief. Thomas pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He tapped the metal barrel against the glass console table. The rhythmic, impatient sound was a demand for immediate compliance. Sign the paper, take the bribe, disappear. I looked up from the waiver. I looked directly into the older man's eyes. The corners of my mouth curled upward, forming a small, tight, unyielding smile. It was the first time I had smiled in 3 days. "You drafted a very thorough waiver, Thomas," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. "But your timeline is flawed." He stopped tapping the pen. His thick gray eyebrows furrowed. "The timeline is standard corporate procedure," he countered. "I am not referring to the waiver," I replied, taking a slow step toward the table. "I am referring to the blind trust allocation document from 4 years ago, the one you just claimed shields David's assets, the one bearing my signature." Jessica shifted her weight nervously. The leather of her boots squeaked against the marble. Thomas stiffened his posture, locking into a rigid defensive stance. "You are a meticulous tax attorney, Thomas," I continued, crossing my arms over my chest. "You ensured the routing numbers were perfect. You filed the LLC registry flawlessly. You used your own daughter to broker the real estate transaction to keep the commission in-house. But you made a profound forensic error regarding the ink." The foyer grew remarkably quiet. The sound of the central air conditioning seemed to vanish. "The blind trust is dated October 14th, 2018, I stated, enunciating every syllable with surgical precision. "However, the signature on the bottom right line is forged. I know this because the ink flow is unusually heavy, pooling at the downward strokes. It is the distinct signature pattern of a medium nib roller ball flowing with premium blue-black ink, specifically a limited edition Cartier pen." I let the silence stretch for 2 full seconds. I wanted him to feel the trap closing around his throat. "You gifted me that exact Cartier pen to celebrate my promotion to director," I said softly. "You presented it to me at a dinner party in May of 2021, 3 years after the trust document was supposedly signed. You backdated a legal filing using a writing instrument that did not yet exist in my possession." Thomas stopped breathing. The healthy color drained from his cheeks, leaving a gray, chalky pallor in its wake. The patriarchal aura dissolved instantly, evaporating into the stale air. The towering corporate litigator was gone, replaced by a terrified old man realizing he had underestimated his opponent. "Ink chromatography is a standard procedure in corporate fraud investigations," I explained, delivering the final blow. "A federal laboratory will easily prove the chemical composition of the signature matches a pen manufactured years after the filing date. You did not secure an asset shield, Thomas. You committed felony forgery and wire fraud across state lines. Your law license is no longer your sword. It is your primary liability." Jessica covered her mouth with both hands, suppressing a sharp gasp. She stared at her father in sheer horror, her eyes wide with the realization that their entire family structure was collapsing. Thomas stared at the marble floor. His hands began to shake. A fine tremor originated in his fingers and traveled up his arms. He reached for the unsigned papers, snatching them off the glass table with uncoordinated, jerky movements. He shoved the documents into his briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. He was unable to meet my gaze. He was terrified of the power I now held. He spun around, grabbing Jessica by the elbow of her cashmere coat, and marched toward the front door. He fumbled with the deadbolt, twisting the brass knob, desperate to escape the sterile trap he had unwittingly walked into. I watched them flee down the driveway toward their luxury sedan. They were panicked. In the logistics sector, when an adversary realizes their primary firewall is breached, they resort to immediate, reckless digital transactions. They try to salvage whatever liquid capital remains. I knew David would attempt a secondary strike. The son would try to execute the moves the father could no longer protect. I needed to act fast. I turned away from the front door and walked straight to my home office to execute a total corporate freeze, preparing to choke off their financial oxygen before Monday morning arrived. The sound of Thomas Walker's sedan accelerating down the suburban street faded into the distance. The front foyer remained empty and silent. I stood alone in the hallway, letting the adrenaline process through my nervous system. The ambush was repelled. The patriarch was broken. But cornered adversaries are unpredictable. They abandon strategy and rely on frantic, desperate speed. I turned around and walked briskly down the hallway to my home office. I secured the heavy oak door and dropped into my ergonomic chair. I woke my workstation preparing the digital fortifications. Friday morning broke with a dull, overcast sky filtering through the wooden blinds. My phone vibrated against the glass desktop precisely at 7 o'clock. A text message appeared on the locked screen. The sender was David. He was currently exiled in a hotel downtown, having fled the guest room sometime during the night, after Thomas briefed him on the failed ambush. I unlocked the device and read the incoming text. I am sorry it has to end this way, Mac, but I have to protect my kids. My attorney advises me that I am legally entitled to half of your 401k and the primary equity in the house. I am shifting the remaining joint funds to an independent account this morning to cover my legal retainers. Let us handle this civilly. He was attempting a digital counterattack. He believed that moving the liquid cash rapidly would give him the upper hand in the impending divorce mediation. He thought he could secure a war chest using my salary, simultaneously threatening my retirement portfolio to force a swift settlement. He relied on the assumption that the traditional banking system moves slowly. He assumed a standard divorce freeze order would take days to process through the county clerk's office, giving him a 48-hour weekend window to offshore the capital. He thought speed would beat preparation. It is a common miscalculation made by amateurs entering a conflict with a seasoned risk manager. David did not understand the architecture of his own embezzlement. When Thomas Walker constructed Harbor Holdings 4 years ago, he faced a logistical hurdle. Initiating a consistent $4,200 monthly wire transfer from a retail joint checking account directly to a Connecticut real estate holding company would eventually trigger an automated fraud alert from our primary bank. The algorithm would flag the recurring out-of-state transaction as suspicious activity. Thomas needed a mask. He utilized my corporate infrastructure to provide it. My global logistics firm maintains a massive, complex vendor payment gateway. We process thousands of invoices daily for independent contractors, freight forwarders, and secondary supply chain partners. Thomas routed the Harbor Holdings payments through a third-party payment processor that interacted seamlessly with my firm's corporate gateway. On paper, the transfers appeared as legitimate recurring payments to a sanctioned logistics vendor. It was a sophisticated, brilliant laundering technique designed to blend the illicit alimony into the massive stream of global corporate commerce. It was a perfect disguise until the host organism discovered the parasite. If I filed a standard suspicious activity report with my retail bank, the investigation would take weeks. The compliance officers would require interviews, affidavits, and a lengthy review process. David would have ample time to drain the accounts. I did not file a slow retail banking report. I opened a secure virtual private network tunnel on my center monitor. I bypassed the standard employee portals and accessed the administrative backend of my firm's global vendor management gateway. The interface was dense, displaying thousands of active accounts and transaction nodes. My credentials granted me top-tier executive clearance. I initiated a targeted query for the specific routing identification number associated with Harbor Holdings, LLC. The system returned the active vendor profile. I highlighted the entity accessing the core compliance dashboard. In the high-stakes world of international logistics, risk managers possess a unilateral kill switch. When we suspect a foreign vendor is operating in violation of international trade laws or funneling capital to sanctioned entities, we do not wait for a court order. We sever the financial artery instantly to protect the parent corporation from catastrophic liability. I clicked the drop-down menu labeled Compliance Status. I changed the designation from active to sanctioned non-compliant entity. I flagged the account under the internal protocols designated for severe anti-money laundering violations. A dialog box appeared requesting a secondary confirmation and an administrative authorization code. I typed my security PIN into the field. I pressed the Enter key. The screen flashed red, indicating the protocol was engaged. The corporate payment gateway immediately slammed shut. Every incoming and outgoing transfer associated with the Harbor Holdings routing number was halted. The assets were locked in a digital vault. But the freeze did not just stop the monthly $4,200 draft. It triggered a cascading compliance lockdown across the entire network of linked accounts. The cashier's check Thomas offered me in the foyer the previous afternoon, the $100,000 bribe designed to secure my silence, was drafted from the primary operating budget of Harbor Holdings. That money was now trapped in federal compliance purgatory. It could not be accessed, moved, or withdrawn without a lengthy, multi-agency federal investigation. David's frantic attempt to shift our remaining joint funds was also tied to the same compromised routing network. The moment he initiated the transfer from his hotel room, the gateway recognized the destination identifier and flagged the transaction. His digital counterattack hit a reinforced steel wall. The financial oxygen for the entire Walker family syndicate was completely cut off. I logged out of the gateway, severing the VPN connection. I picked up my phone and drafted a single, brief reply to David. "The joint accounts are secure. Have your attorney contact Greg." I hit send. I did not wait for a response. I turned my attention to the pristine blue manila folder resting on the corner of my desk. The evidence vault was fully compiled. The Easy Pass logs, the forged blind trust document, the Connecticut property deed, the bonus transfer receipts, and the UCC filings detailing the predatory mezzanine loans. I gathered the folder, sliding it into my leather briefcase. I left the house and drove directly to the sleek, glass-paneled high-rise in downtown Newark, housing the offices of Gregory Vance. Greg is a senior partner specializing in complex corporate litigation. He is ruthless, unsentimental, and terrifyingly efficient. He does not negotiate domestic disputes. He liquidates fraudulent enterprises. I sat across from him in his minimalist office. I placed the blue folder on his desk. I briefed him on the network architecture, the forged signatures, the disguised alimony, and the internal compliance freeze I had just executed. He reviewed the documents, his eyes scanning the ink chromatography timeline and the predatory loan defaults. He closed the folder, steepled his fingers, and looked at me. His expression was a mixture of professional respect and cold anticipation. "This is not a divorce filing, Mackenzie," he stated. "This is a civil suit for massive financial fraud. We are going to dismantle them entirely. Draft an emergency ex parte injunction," I instructed. "I want every single personal and business account tied to David or Thomas legally paralyzed before the courts open on Monday morning. I want them to wake up realizing they cannot purchase a cup of coffee without asking my permission." Greg nodded, reaching for his dictation recorder. The legal machinery was engaged. But I knew the paper trail was only half the battle. Legal maneuvering requires time. I needed to accelerate the collapse of their psychological defenses. I needed an inside witness, someone deeply embedded in the shadow operation who possessed first-hand knowledge of the deception. The patriarch was fighting me. The husband was fighting me. The sister was complicit. The only remaining piece on the chessboard was the mistress. Sarah was sitting in a foreclosed home in Stamford, terrified, broke, and furious at the men who lied to her. I needed to weaponize her desperation. I stood up from Greg's desk, checked the time, and prepared to drive across the state line to execute the most dangerous, unlikely alliance of my entire career. 1:00 in the afternoon on a Monday. The sky over Fairfield County hung low and gray, promising sleet. I sat in a booth at the back of an upscale independent coffee shop in downtown Stamford. The location was a neutral zone, carefully selected. It was 2 miles from the foreclosed Harbor Holdings property, public enough to prevent a hysterical outburst, and quiet enough for a high-stakes negotiation. A steaming Americano rested on the table in front of me, next to a thick, unmarked manila envelope. The door chime jingled, cutting through the low hum of acoustic background music. Sarah stepped into the warmth of the cafe. She stood just inside the entrance, scanning the room with the erratic, darting gaze of a woman operating under severe duress. She spotted me and walked over, her posture rigid with defensive hostility. She wore an expensive camel-colored wool coat. A flash of recognition sparked in my mind. The garment was from a designer boutique in Manhattan. The retail price exceeded $2,000. I recognized it because I had paid the credit card statement containing the charge 6 months ago, assuming David purchased it as a corporate gift for a high-end client. The coat, like everything else in her life, was funded by my labor. She slid into the booth opposite me. She did not remove the coat. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes partially concealed by a heavy layer of makeup. She was preparing for a catfight. She was bracing for insults, accusations, and the standard messy emotional fallout of a confronted mistress. I gave her none of those things. I did not greet her. I picked up the unmarked manila envelope and slid it slowly across the polished wood table. It stopped inches from her folded arms. "David is bankrupt," I stated. The tone was clinical, precise, and completely devoid of empathy. Sarah stiffened. Her chin jutted out, a weak attempt to project defiance. "You are lying," she snapped, her voice carrying a brittle edge. "He told me you would try to manipulate me. He told me you were holding up the estate transfers out of spite." "There is no estate," I replied smoothly. "The trust fund you believe you are inheriting is a fabrication. Evelyn Walker died carrying $80,000 in unsecured credit card debt and a reverse mortgage on a house she did not own outright. The estate you are fighting for is currently $80,000 in the red." Sarah stared at me. Her defensive posture cracked just a fraction. A flicker of genuine uncertainty passed behind her eyes. "He showed me the paperwork." She whispered, the defiance leaking from her voice. "I saw the account balances. He promised the boys a permanent future." I gestured to the envelope resting on the table. "Open it," I instructed. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the brown paper as if it contained a live explosive. Her hands, trembling slightly, reached forward. She unfastened the metal clasp and pulled the contents out onto the table. The first document on the stack was a printed copy of the Uniform Commercial Code filings I extracted from the county clerk database. I watched her eyes scan the dense legal text. She was not a financial analyst, but the numbers were impossible to misunderstand. "Those are predatory mezzanine loan defaults," I explained, narrating her realization. "David leveraged every commercial property his firm manages. He used the capital to float your lifestyle after his mother's pension dried up. He owes millions of dollars to hard money lenders." She turned to the next page. It was the 48-hour eviction notice docket history for the Stamford house. "And that is the reality of your current living situation," I continued. "Harbor Holdings, LLC did not simply forget to make a payment. The property was sold at a sheriff's auction 3 weeks ago because David ran out of other people's money to steal." Sarah reached the final document in the stack. It was a replica of the blind trust allocation form, the very document Thomas Walker forged to siphon the initial $140,000 from my performance bonus to secure her down payment. Beside it, I had included the fake trust fund summaries David presented to her, side by side with the actual depleted bank statements. The reality of the deception hit her with catastrophic force. The hostility completely dissolved, evaporating into sheer, paralyzing horror. She dropped the papers. She covered her mouth with both hands, suppressing a ragged gasp. Her eyes widened, filling with tears that were not born of grief, but of profound betrayal. She stared at the documents, her entire worldview disintegrating in the span of 90 seconds. For 7 years, she believed she was the hidden, cherished priority of a wealthy real estate developer. She sacrificed her prime earning years, bore his children, and lived in the shadows, clinging to the promise of eventual legitimacy and immense financial security. She endured the secrecy because she believed the payoff would be generational wealth. She realized in that coffee shop that she was never the priority. She was a liability managed by a syndicate of con artists. She was the mistress of a broke fraudster running a failing Ponzi scheme. David lied to her about the trust fund just as effectively as he lied to me about his business trips. We were both victims of the exact same host. "I gave everything for him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I gave up my career. I kept quiet. I hid my own children from the world. We have nowhere to go. My name is on the secondary lien for the Stamford house. When the foreclosure finalizes, my credit is destroyed. We are ruined." She looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with tears. The arrogance was gone. She was a woman staring into an abyss. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her comfort. I offered her a transaction. I am currently executing a total financial liquidation of the Walker family, I stated calmly. By Monday morning, David and his father will be legally paralyzed by an emergency injunction. Their accounts are frozen. Their credit lines are severed. They are going to face federal investigations for wire fraud and embezzlement. If you remain allied with them, you will go down as a co-conspirator. She swallowed hard, her eyes wide with terror. What do you want from me? I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a single typed sheet of paper. I placed it on top of the pile of evidence. It was a formal legal affidavit drafted by Greg earlier that morning. "Sign this," I demanded. She looked down at the document. "What is it?" "It is a sworn statement," I replied. "It details exactly how Thomas Walker instructed you to handle the Harbor Holdings LLC paperwork. It outlines his role as the architect of the real estate transaction. It confirms that he explicitly advised you to keep the property registration hidden to avoid detection during a potential divorce discovery." I tapped the paper with my index finger. "If you sign this affidavit effectively turning state's evidence against the patriarch, I will grant you a single concession. I am the primary victim of the fraud, which means my corporate litigator has the power to petition the court to halt the foreclosure proceedings temporarily. I will allow the Stamford house to be sold at a rapid, below-market rate. The sale will clear the secondary lien debt bearing your name. You walk away with zero profit, but you avoid bankruptcy. You save your credit rating, and you avoid federal charges." Sarah stared at the affidavit. The proposition was brutal. It required her to actively participate in the destruction of the man who fathered her children and the family that sustained her. But it was the only life raft available in a rapidly sinking ship. She looked at the fake trust fund documents, the proof of a 7-year lie, and the anger finally eclipsed the fear. The syndicate used her. I was giving her the tool to dismantle them. She reached a trembling hand across the table. I unclasped my purse, retrieved my limited edition Cartier pen, and set it down next to the affidavit. The golden nib gleamed under the cafe lights. She picked up the pen. She did not hesitate. She pressed the heavy ink to the paper and signed her full legal name at the bottom of the page. The mistress became the ultimate whistleblower. I took the signed document, placed it inside my briefcase, and stood up from the booth. The alliance was forged. The evidence was secured. The trap was fully set. I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting alone with the ruins of her life, preparing to deliver the final blow in a Newark mediation room. Wednesday morning arrived with the sharp, persistent ring of my cell phone. The caller ID displayed the number for Greg, my corporate litigator. I answered on the second ring. The tone of his voice carried the crisp satisfaction of a well-executed legal maneuver. The emergency injunction had served its purpose. The digital chokehold I initiated on Friday afternoon through the vendor gateway had spread like a virus across the Walker family's entire financial network by Monday. The retail banks complied with the court orders. The credit lines snapped shut. Greg informed me that David attempted to pay for his downtown hotel room on Tuesday evening, and every single card in his leather wallet returned a declined status. Thomas Walker found his personal checking accounts locked, pending a federal review of suspected wire fraud. The syndicate was suffocating. They could not breathe, so they demanded a parley. Greg told me that opposing counsel had formally requested an emergency mediation session. They booked a conference room at a prestigious legal firm in downtown Newark for 1 o'clock that afternoon. Their objective was singular. They wanted to force a rapid settlement to lift the asset freeze before the required disclosure period unearthed the full scope of their liability. I hung up the phone and walked into my master closet. When a risk manager prepares for a hostile termination, Wardrobe is not a matter of fashion. It is a matter of psychological warfare. You dress to reflect the environment you intend to create. I selected a tailored charcoal gray suit. The fabric was heavy Italian wool, cut with sharp, uncompromising lines. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black leather pumps. I stood in front of the full-length mirror. I examined my reflection. I did not look like a woman whose 8-year marriage had just disintegrated. My eyes were clear. My posture was rigid. I looked like an executive auditor arriving to liquidate a corrupt, insolvent subsidiary. I walked into my home office to prepare the ammunition. I laid my leather briefcase flat on the glass desktop. The brass latches clicked open, echoing in the quiet room. I reached for the evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past 96 hours. I organized the paperwork into 3 distinct, pristine blue manila folders. Folder number 1 contained the marital asset fraud. It held the E-ZPass transit logs, proving the fake Hartford business trips. It held the banking wire transfers, tracking the stolen $140,000 bonus. Most importantly, it contained the blind trust allocation document, the physical proof of the forged signature engineered by Thomas Walker. Folder number 2 contained the internal corruption. It held the Connecticut property deed and the closing disclosure forms. It highlighted the $22,000 real estate commission pocketed by Jessica Walker. It was the document that shattered the red herring of the innocent weeping sister. Folder number 3 contained the kill shot. It held the sworn legal affidavit signed by Sarah in the Stamford coffee shop just 48 hours prior. It was a direct, notarized testimony from the mistress detailing exactly how the patriarch instructed her to launder the stolen capital and hide the assets. I placed the 3 blue folders inside the leather compartment. I retrieved my gold Cartier pen, checking the ink cartridge one final time, and clipped it to the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I closed the briefcase and locked the brass latches. The dramatic irony of the impending afternoon hung thick in the air. David and Thomas were walking into the Newark high-rise, believing they held a superior tactical position. They assumed Sarah was maintaining radio silence out of steadfast loyalty. They assumed the forged blind trust document remained an impenetrable legal shield. They thought they were attending a standard divorce negotiation. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughterhouse. At 12:45, Greg and I stepped out of the elevator onto the 40th floor of the Newark Legal Tower. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of polished concrete, frosted glass, and brushed steel. A receptionist in a dark suit escorted us down a long, quiet corridor toward the reserved mediation suite. We entered a large conference room enclosed entirely by soundproof glass walls. The city skyline stretched out behind the mahogany negotiation table. David and Thomas were already seated on the far side of the room. They were flanked by their defense attorney, a sleek, overconfident litigator wearing a pinstripe suit and a condescending smile. I observed the physical state of the syndicate. Thomas attempted to project his usual aura of patriarchal dominance, sitting tall with his hands steepled under his chin. But the facade was fraying. The knot of his tie was slightly crooked. The skin around his eyes looked bruised and drawn. The stress of the frozen accounts was eroding his composure. David, however, was practically vibrating with unearned false confidence. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive shirt, leaning back in his leather chair. He caught my eye as I walked into the room. He did not look ashamed. He looked defiant. He firmly believed his father's legal maneuvering had trapped me in an unwinnable corner. Greg and I took our seats on the opposing side of the mahogany table. I placed my leather briefcase squarely in front of me. I did not open it. I rested my hands flat on the polished wood. The appointed mediator, a retired state judge with a tired expression, initiated the session. He recited the standard preliminary platitudes, reminding both parties of the benefits of an amicable resolution, outlining the rules of civil discourse. I tuned out the procedural drone. I kept my eyes fixed on my husband. David could not endure the silence. The moment the mediator opened the floor for initial statements, David leaned forward, a smug, patronizing smirk twisting the corners of his mouth. "We are willing to be reasonable, Mac," he began, his tone dripping with fake benevolence. "I understand you are hurt. I understand the incident at the church was shocking, but your reaction has been hysterical and legally unfounded. Freezing the operational accounts of Harbor Holdings is a violation of the trust agreement you signed 4 years ago. He paused, glancing at his attorney, who nodded in agreement. My legal counsel has advised me to file a countersuit for financial damages. David continued, puffing out his chest. But I do not want to see you ruined. I am willing to offer you a very generous alimony package. We will ensure you maintain your current lifestyle. You keep your retirement accounts. I will even cover your legal fees for today. All you have to do is drop these absurd fraud allegations, release the injunction on my business accounts, and sign the divorce papers. We can all walk away clean. He leaned back in his chair again, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he had just delivered a checkmate. He was waiting for me to capitulate. He was waiting for the heartbroken wife to realize she was outmatched by the men in the room. I did not flinch. I did not glare. I simply sat there, perfectly still, letting his words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of the conference room. In the discipline of risk management, you never interrupt an adversary while they are documenting their own liability. You allow them to speak. You allow them to enter their false confidence into the official record. Every word David spoke was recorded by the mediator. Every lie he presented solidified his impending destruction. I let the silence stretch for 30 excruciating seconds. The smirk on David's face began to waver, melting into a rigid mask of uncertainty. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting toward my locked briefcase. The defense attorney cleared his throat, suddenly sensing the atmospheric pressure in the room dropping to a dangerous level. I reached forward and rested my thumbs against the twin brass latches of my leather bag. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot across the mahogany table. I was ready to open the vault. I was ready to let them dig their own graves. The brass latches on my briefcase clicked open. The sound cut sharply through the heavy silence of the glass-walled conference room. I did not immediately reach inside. I kept my hands resting lightly on the leather flap. I watched the men sitting across the mahogany table. David's smug expression had faltered, replaced by a tense, nervous twitch near his jawline. Thomas Walker leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood, his eyes narrowed into a dark, calculating squint. He was a veteran of countless high-stakes depositions. He knew the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure meant incoming hostile data. The retired judge, serving as our mediator, cleared his throat, attempting to wrest control of the pacing back to his side of the room. He adjusted his half-moon reading glasses and looked down at his preliminary notes. If there are no further opening remarks, the mediator began, his voice dry and administrative, we should proceed to the core financial disputes. Counsel for the respondent has submitted a preliminary brief indicating a demand for spousal support, citing a disparity in current liquid assets and recent unforeseen market losses impacting the respondent's primary commercial real estate firm. David's defense attorney, a sleek man named Sterling, seized the opening. He sat up straighter, adjusting the cuffs of his pinstripe suit. He deployed a smooth, practiced tone designed to sound entirely reasonable while delivering outrageous demands. That is correct, Your Honor, Sterling stated smoothly. My client has suffered significant financial setbacks over the past 3 fiscal quarters. The commercial development sector is highly volatile. Furthermore, the unilateral and frankly malicious injunction placed on his business accounts by the petitioner has severely impaired his ability to service his existing corporate debt. We argue that the petitioner, given her substantial and uninterrupted corporate salary, bears a fiduciary responsibility to provide temporary spousal maintenance to prevent the total collapse of his firm during these proceedings. I felt Greg, my own litigator, shift slightly in his chair beside me. I placed a subtle hand on his forearm beneath the level of the table, signaling him to remain silent. You do not interrupt an adversary when they are actively constructing a fictional narrative on the official record. You let them build the entire house of cards before you pull the foundation out from under them. David nodded in solemn agreement with his attorney's statement. He looked at the mediator, his eyes wide, projecting the image of a hardworking businessman victimized by economic downturns and a vindictive spouse. It has been a brutal year for retail leasing. David added, his voice laced with manufactured fatigue. I have been working tirelessly to keep my company afloat, to provide for our future. The injunction Mac filed is not just punishing me, it is punishing my employees. It is punishing the vendors who rely on our contracts. The audacity was breathtaking. He was invoking the livelihood of phantom employees to justify his demand for my money. He was utilizing the language of corporate responsibility to shield a predatory Ponzi scheme. I turned my attention to Thomas. The patriarch recognized his cue to enter the fray. He reached into his own leather folio and extracted a single sheet of paper. He slid it toward the center of the mahogany table. Furthermore, Thomas interjected, his baritone voice echoing off the glass walls. The petitioner's claim regarding the assets held by Harbor Holdings, LLC, is entirely without merit. Harbor Holdings is an independent corporate entity. The initial capital transfer cited in their injunction request was executed under the strict parameters of a blind trust allocation agreement. Thomas tapped the document with his index finger. It was the forged trust form. This document, Thomas continued projecting unwavering authority, was reviewed and signed by Mackenzie Walker 4 years ago. It legally authorized the transfer of funds into a protected investment vehicle. She cannot retroactively claim financial fraud simply because she is unhappy with the current state of her marriage. The trust is binding. Harbor Holdings is a legally shielded entity. The corporate veil cannot be pierced by a domestic dispute. For 20 agonizing minutes, the room belonged to them. Sterling presented a spreadsheet detailing David's alleged market losses. Thomas delivered a patronizing lecture on the sanctity of corporate shielding laws. David played the wounded martyr, sighing heavily and staring mournfully out the window at the Newark skyline. They established their lies layer upon layer, cementing their false narrative into the mediator's official notes. The tension in the room peaked heavy and suffocating. They finished their coordinated assault and leaned back in their leather chairs, looking across the table with triumphant, expectant glares. They thought they had cornered me. They thought the combined weight of their legal bluster had crushed my resolve. I looked at Greg. He gave me a single, imperceptible nod. The trap was full. I lifted the flap of my briefcase. I reached inside and retrieved the first pristine blue manila folder. I set it down on the mahogany table. The vibrant color stood out sharply against the dark wood. I opened the cardboard cover. I did not address David. I did not address Thomas or their sleek attorney. I directed my gaze entirely toward the retired judge sitting at the head of the table. Your Honor, I began, my voice a calm, even current cutting through the residual bluster of the room. The narrative presented by the respondent regarding market losses and legitimate corporate entities is a fabrication designed to obscure a massive, premeditated embezzlement operation. Sterling opened his mouth to object. I raised my hand, silencing him with a sharp, authoritative gesture. I slid a thick stack of paper across the polished wood toward the mediator. The first document on top was the comprehensive EZ-Pass transit log. The respondent claims to have spent the past 3 years developing retail spaces in Hartford, Connecticut. I stated, clinically. These transit authority records prove his vehicle never traveled beyond exit 8 in Stamford. 3 days a week, for 36 months, he terminated his route 40 miles short of his stated destination. David's smirk vanished instantly. His posture stiffened. The color began to drain from his face, returning to the ashen pallor he exhibited in my home office days prior. I slid the second document across the table. It was the municipal property tax record for the Stamford house. He was not commuting to a construction site. I continued, my eyes locked on the mediator. He was commuting to a secondary residence, a residence occupied by his mistress and 2 children. The mortgage and property taxes for this home were paid through an entity known as Harbor Holdings, LLC. Sterling shot a panicked glance at David. The defense attorney was suddenly realizing his client had withheld critical, devastating facts. A lawyer cannot defend against a weapon he does not know exists. Thomas Walker intervened, his voice rising in volume, attempting to deploy volume to mask his panic. This is irrelevant to the asset division. As I have clearly stated, Harbor Holdings is protected by the blind trust agreement. The origin of the funds is legally shielded. I waited for Thomas to finish his sentence. I extracted the third document from the blue folder. It was the payroll stub detailing my $150,000 performance bonus, stapled directly to the banking wire transfer receipt. I slid the evidence toward the center of the table. The origin of the funds is not shielded. Thomas, I countered, turning my icy gaze toward the patriarch. The origin of the funds was a direct transfer of $140,000 from my corporate bonus structure, rerouted less than 12 hours after the deposit cleared. These documents prove the premeditated dissipation of marital assets categorized as felony fraud under state law. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted violently. The bluster evaporated. The air felt thin, charged with adrenaline. Thomas was a highly skilled former attorney. He possessed decades of courtroom experience. He did not retreat. He dug in his heels. He initiated a grueling legal chess match, parrying my claims with technical objections. He cited case law regarding irrevocable trusts. He aggressively defended the signature on the document, insisting that forensic disputes belonged in a criminal court, not a civil mediation. He argued that even if the funds were used for personal reasons, the LLC structure itself remained a legitimate, impenetrable corporate vehicle. Sterling regained his footing, jumping back into the fray, supporting Thomas's technical defense. They built a rapid, dense wall of legal jargon, attempting to obscure the raw theft beneath layers of corporate statutes. They argued back and forth, with Greg debating jurisdictional precedents and discovery limits. The pacing of the room slowed from a rapid assault to a grinding, brutal trench war. For 10 minutes, the two defense lawyers threw every legal obstacle they possessed onto the mahogany table. They fought with the desperation of men trying to plug a ruptured dam with their bare hands. Slowly, the panic began to recede from David's face. He watched his father and his attorney construct the technical defense. He saw the mediator taking careful notes, nodding at the citations of corporate shielding laws. David leaned back in his chair again. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. He looked at me, a faint glimmer of relief sparking in his eyes. They thought the blind trust argument was holding. They thought they had survived the initial ambush. They believed the fortress was battered, but still standing. They did not realize I was holding the second blue folder. The dense barrage of legal terminology hung over the mahogany table. Thomas Walker adjusted his cuffs, pulling his suit sleeves down with a sharp, decisive tug. A faint, self-satisfied smile returned to his lips. He glanced at the retired judge, confident his technical defense had successfully stalled the momentum of the audit. He believed he had insulated the Harbor Holdings structure behind an impenetrable wall of corporate precedent. He thought he had won the room. I reached for the second pristine blue manila folder. I opened the cardboard cover. The movement was slow, deliberate. I did not rush. When you dismantle an adversary's primary defense, you let them savor their false victory for a few agonizing seconds before you obliterate it entirely. Your Honor, I began, my voice slicing through the residual quiet of the conference room. The Respondents' Counsel is arguing that Harbor Holdings, LLC is a legitimate, arm's-length corporate entity independent of familial influence. They are arguing the transactions were standard business operations. I extracted a thick stack of paper from the folder. It was the complete closing disclosure package for the Stamford property. The top sheet bore the official seals of Fairfield County. That argument relies on the assumption of operational isolation. I continued, my gaze locking onto Thomas. I slid the closing documents across the polished wood, stopping them directly in front of the mediator. But this was not an isolated affair executed by a rogue husband. This was a coordinated, fully integrated family syndicate. Thomas's self-satisfied smile vanished. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward, straining his neck to read the upside-down text on the documents resting in front of the judge. I directed the mediator's attention to the specific line item I had highlighted in bright yellow ink. If you examine page 3 of the closing disclosure I instructed you, will find the designated buying agent for this transaction. The agent who located the property, drafted the purchase agreement, and facilitated the transfer of the embezzled $140,000. The retired judge adjusted his reading glasses. He peered at the highlighted text. The buying agent listed is Jessica Walker. I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. The sister of the respondent, the daughter of the man currently attempting to shield this entity. David flinched violently as if he had been physically struck. He turned his head sharply, staring at his father. The unified front of the syndicate was fracturing. Furthermore, I continued maintaining a relentless driving cadence. You will note the compensation schedule on the adjacent column. Jessica Walker pocketed a $22,000 real estate commission from this transaction. She directly profited from the theft of my corporate bonus. She actively procured the asset used to house her brother's mistress. The atmosphere in the conference room dropped to sub-zero. The air conditioning hummed, sounding exceptionally loud in the sudden, paralyzing silence. Thomas's confident facade cracked entirely. The color drained from his face for the second time that week. He opened his mouth to object, raising a shaking hand, but the words died in his throat. He had constructed his entire legal defense on the premise that the LLC was an independent entity. By proving his own daughter brokered the deal and extracted a profit, I shattered the illusion of independence. I proved the corporate veil was a sham, a hollow structure designed solely to launder stolen marital assets within the family unit. Sterling, the sleek defense attorney, sat perfectly still. He did not object. He did not jump to the defense of his clients. He stared at the highlighted closing document, his eyes wide, with a horrifying realization. A defense attorney can navigate complex financial disputes. A defense attorney can argue the nuances of asset division. But a defense attorney cannot knowingly participate in the cover-up of an active, multi-party criminal conspiracy without jeopardizing his own license to practice law. Sterling turned his head slowly, looking at David and Thomas. The expression on his face was no longer one of confident partnership. It was an expression of profound, hostile suspicion. He realized in that moment that his clients had lied to him. They had withheld the critical involvement of the sister. They had marched him into a mediation room and used him as a human shield to defend a coordinated fraud ring. Your Honor, Sterling stammered, his smooth, practiced tone fracturing into nervous hesitation. We were unaware of the familial relation of the broker involved in this specific transaction. I need a moment to confer with my clients regarding this new data. No, I interrupted, my voice sharp as a scalpel. There will be no recess. The data is on the record. I looked at Thomas. The patriarch was cornered. His legal shielding was obliterated. His daughter was implicated. His son was exposed. The syndicate was laid bare on the mahogany table for the mediator to see. But Thomas Walker was a man who spent his life refusing to surrender. He was a creature of stubborn, arrogant resilience. When a cornered animal runs out of sophisticated tactics, it relies on brute force. He slammed his fist against the table. The coffee cups rattled. This is an absurd mischaracterization of events, Thomas roared, his baritone voice echoing violently in the enclosed space. Jessica is a licensed professional. She handled a standard real estate transaction. You are attempting to drag innocent family members into your bitter divorce proceedings using circumstantial connections. He pointed a long, shaking finger at the forged blind trust document still sitting near the center of the table. None of this changes the fundamental legal reality, Thomas snarled, his eyes burning with desperate fury. You signed that trust allocation, Mackenzie. You authorized the transfer of the initial capital. The funds were legally rerouted. You can parade toll logs and broker commissions around this room all day, but that signature binds you. It holds up in court. You cannot prove you did not sign it. He was clinging to the forgery. It was his final, desperate lifeline. He believed the digital ink on the PDF was an unbreakable seal. He thought a forensic dispute over a signature would require months of litigation, buying them enough time to unfreeze the accounts and offshore the remaining capital. He thought he was holding the trump card. I did not respond to his shouting. I did not match his volume. I allowed his desperate roar to echo and fade into the cold silence of the room. I looked at Greg. My litigator offered a faint, predatory smile. I reached for the third and final blue manila folder resting inside my leather briefcase. The trap was fully primed. The adversary had committed all his resources to defending a single, fatal point of failure. It was time to execute the corporate dissolution. Thomas Walker's desperate challenge echoed off the soundproof glass. His chest heaved with exertion. He kept his long finger pointed aggressively at the forged blind trust document, anchoring his entire defense on that single fraudulent signature. He believed the burden of proof rested entirely on my shoulders. He thought he had forced the mediation into a lengthy, intractable forensic stalemate. I did not reach for the third blue folder immediately. Instead, I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. My fingers closed around the smooth, grooved metal of my limited edition Cartier pen. I withdrew the instrument. The gold nib glinted sharply under the recessed overhead lighting of the conference room. I extended my arm over the mahogany table. I did not throw the pen. I placed it gently, deliberately beside the forged document. The heavy metal settled against the polished wood with a dull, final thud. "You are relying on the integrity of that signature, Thomas," I stated. My voice was a soft, lethal hum, barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward to hear me. "You are staking your entire legal career and your son's financial future on the assumption that a civil court will accept that ink at face value." Thomas stared at the gold pen. A flicker of unease crossed his rigid features. He recognized the instrument. He gifted it to me. "You drafted the blind trust in October of 2018. I continued my gaze, locking onto his eyes. "You backdated the filing to shield the theft of my bonus, but you forged my signature using this exact pen. You did so because the ink flow is distinctive, heavy, and impossible to replicate with a standard ballpoint. You thought the structural perfection of the signature would prevent scrutiny." I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, allowing the trap to tighten. "However, you made a catastrophic error in your chronological calculus," I said, maintaining the relentless, quiet cadence. "Cartier did not manufacture this specific limited edition series until early 2021. You presented it to me at a dinner party in May of that year." The color vanished from Thomas's face entirely. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine, hearing the pressure plate click beneath his heel. "A Fedwell laboratory will conduct an ink chromatography analysis," I explained, delivering the forensic reality with chilling precision. "They will easily prove the chemical composition of the ink on a document allegedly signed in 2018 matches a proprietary formula that did not exist until 3 years later." Sterling, the defense attorney, recoiled, physically pressing his back against his leather chair. He looked at Thomas with undisguised horror. The defense attorney realized he was not just representing a man hiding assets in a divorce. He was actively defending a man who committed felony forgery and wire fraud across state lines. "You did not secure an asset shield, Thomas," I stated, my voice echoing the exact words I used in my foyer days prior. But this time, the words carried the weight of the official mediation record. "You manufactured a prison sentence." Thomas opened his mouth. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. The towering patriarch, the veteran litigator, was utterly paralyzed by his own arrogance. He stared at the Cartier pen resting on the table as if it were a venomous serpent preparing to strike. Before he could summon a defense, before he could attempt to gaslight the room or dispute the manufacturing dates, I reached for the third and final blue manila folder. I opened the cardboard cover. I extracted a single crisp sheet of paper. It was not a complex financial spreadsheet. It was not a municipal property deed. It was a formal, legal affidavit, stamped with the raised circular seal of a Connecticut notary public. I slid the affidavit across the table, stopping it directly in front of David's defense attorney. Sterling looked down at the document. He read the header. His eyes widened. "That is a sworn, notarized statement executed 48 hours ago," I announced, addressing the mediator but ensuring every man in the room heard the lethal finality in my tone. "The affiant is Sarah, the woman residing in the Stamford property." David gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air. The false confidence that had sustained him throughout the mediation shattered completely. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He realized the secondary liability the mistress he had lied to and abandoned in a foreclosed home had flipped. In this affidavit, I continued, my voice cold and unyielding. Sarah details the exact instructions she received regarding the laundering of the stolen marital capital. She testifies under penalty of perjury that Thomas Walker explicitly directed her to conceal the Harbor Holdings registry to avoid detection during a potential divorce discovery. She testifies that Thomas Walker orchestrated the entire shadow operation to defraud me of my corporate earnings. The silence in the conference room was absolute, total, and devastating. The syndicate was dismantled. The financial ledgers were exposed. The patriarch was implicated by his own operative. The corporate veil was not just pierced, it was shredded, burned, and scattered. I looked at Thomas. The arrogant litigator was gone. He looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. I looked at David. My husband of 8 years was trembling, a sheen of cold sweat coating his forehead. I rested my hands flat on the table. The time for negotiation was over. The time for the ultimatum had arrived. "If you do not sign over 100% of the marital equity to me right now," I said softly, the words carrying the brutal weight of an execution order. "This affidavit goes directly to the State Bar Association Ethics Committee. The forgery evidence, the EZ-Pass logs, and the ink chromatography timeline go directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Thomas closed his eyes. He lowered his head, resting his chin on his chest. He knew the parameters of the threat. If the State Bar reviewed the affidavit, he would be disbarred, stripped of his pension, and disgraced in the legal community he spent 4 decades cultivating. If the FBI reviewed the forgery, he would spend his final years in a federal penitentiary. David finally broke. The stoic facade cracked, giving way to raw, unfiltered panic. He buried his face in his hands. A ragged, ugly sob tore through his throat. "Mac, please," he wept, his voice muffled and desperate. "You cannot do this. You are leaving me with nothing. The commercial properties are leveraged to the breaking point. If you take the house, if you take the remaining liquid cash, my firm will fire me. If I default on those mezzanine loans, the board of directors will strip my shares and terminate my contract. I will be ruined. You have to leave me something to survive." He begged for mercy, using the exact same emotional manipulation script he attempted in my home office. He expected the tears to soften the blow. He expected the mention of his impending ruin to trigger my empathy. I looked at him with total, chilling detachment. The grief had long since evaporated, replaced entirely by the surgical precision of an auditor completing a complex liquidation. "You misunderstand the current status of your employment, David," I replied. My voice was a flat, sterile line. He looked up, his face streaked with tears, confusion battling with the terror in his eyes. "What?" "I did not bring the Uniform Commercial Code filings detailing your predatory loan defaults to this mediation," I explained calmly. "I did not include them in the folders on this table. I did not bring them because they are irrelevant to our domestic asset division." I paused, letting the silence stretch, allowing the final blow to hang in the air before it landed. "I forwarded those specific loan documents to the board of directors at your commercial real estate firm an hour ago," I stated. "I included a detailed summary outlining your breach of fiduciary duty and your reckless leveraging of their flagship properties to fund a clandestine personal operation." David's jaw dropped. The breath left his lungs in a single sharp exhale. "You do not have a job, David," I said, delivering the ultimate consequence. "The board is currently convening an emergency session to execute your termination. You are not facing ruin tomorrow. You are ruined right now." The audit is complete. Thomas and David stared at the documents spread across the mahogany table. They were utterly paralyzed, trapped in a silent, suffocating nightmare of their own design. They realized the woman they treated as a host organism, the woman they assumed was blind and complacent, had systematically dismantled their entire lives, severing every financial, professional, and social lifeline they possessed. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the retired judge who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and profound professional respect. I looked at Sterling, who was actively packing his briefcase, preparing to abandon his toxic clients the moment the session concluded. I had neutralized the threat. I had balanced the ledger. The corporate dissolution was perfectly executed. Now I only needed to sign the final paperwork and walk out of the glass room, leaving the syndicate to burn in the ashes of their own greed. The mediation room fell into a heavy, unbroken quiet the moment my terms hung in the sterile air. Thomas Walker stared at the Cartier pen resting on the mahogany table. He did not attempt another objection. He reached forward, his fingers shaking so severely he could barely grip the metal barrel of his own fountain pen. He signed the asset forfeiture agreement. First, his signature a jagged, erratic shadow of its former confident flourish. David signed next. He did not read the stipulations. He merely dragged the ink across the dotted line, while silent tears stained the thick parchment. I stood up, retrieved the 3 blue folders, and secured them inside my leather briefcase. The brass latches clicked shut, sealing their fate. I walked out of the glass enclosure alongside Greg, leaving the father and son sitting in the ruins of their own hubris. The elevator ride down to the lobby was smooth, swift, and remarkably light. The burden of a shadow operation no longer rested on my shoulders. 7 months passed. The bitter chill of winter yielded to the crisp, bright humidity of late summer in New Jersey. I sit in my home office today. The space belongs entirely to me. The mortgage is satisfied in full, the deed cleared of any secondary encumbrances. 2 weeks ago, the executive board at the global logistics firm evaluated my handling of internal risk matrices and elevated my title. I now serve as the Vice President of Global Compliance. My purview expanded, my compensation adjusted accordingly. The promotion felt like a natural progression, a testament to the fact that rigorous audits yield profitable results. David avoided a federal indictment by capitulating to every single demand Greg drafted. He surrendered the primary residence, his share of our liquid joint accounts, and his claims to my retirement portfolio. The board of directors at his commercial real estate firm executed their termination clause within 48 hours of receiving my comprehensive dossier. The sudden loss of his executive salary triggered a rapid domino effect across his remaining personal ledgers. He currently resides in a cramped second-floor walk-up apartment in Queens. He commutes via public transit to a mid-tier sales position at a regional building supply company, hawking wholesale drywall to independent contractors. His wages are heavily garnished to satisfy the crushing penalties of his defaulted mezzanine loans. The man who once toasted to building empires with vintage champagne now spends his evenings calculating subway fares and evaluating microwave dinner costs. The tailored suits he wore to project success hang uselessly in a small closet, smelling faintly of transit exhaust and stale cooking oil. Sarah adhered to the strict terms of our Stanford coffee shop arrangement. Armed with her sworn affidavit, Greg petitioned the court to stall the Fairfield County Sheriff. We secured a brief, narrow window of opportunity. Sarah listed the property at a steep discount, liquidating the asset just hours before the sheriff's gavel fell. The sale satisfied the secondary lien, clearing her name from the debt registry. She avoided formal bankruptcy, but she walked away with zero equity. She packed her 2 children into a rented moving truck and relocated back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house in upstate New York. The Phantom Trust Fund evaporated into the ether, leaving her to face the harsh, unglamorous reality of raising a family on a single entry-level income. The designer coats and the Connecticut zip code are artifacts of a past she can no longer afford to remember. The most profound consequence, however, did not involve federal agents or criminal prosecutors. It involved the very social fabric the Walker family prized above all else. When a Ponzi scheme collapses, the collateral damage inevitably strikes the investors closest to the epicenter. The high-risk predatory loans David defaulted on were not held by anonymous Wall Street bankers. They were secured against commercial properties owned by Thomas's inner circle. The retired tax attorney had leveraged his own country club relationships to secure capital for his son, using his reputation to guarantee the toxic debt. When the defaults triggered, the creditors seized the assets of Thomas's wealthy golf partners. The retribution was swift and merciless. Men who spent decades trading favors over scotch and cigars turned on the patriarch with ferocious litigation. 3 of his former closest friends filed civil suits against him for legal malpractice and breach of fiduciary duty, claiming he knowingly provided fraudulent financial counsel to prop up a failing enterprise. The lawsuits drained his pristine retirement accounts. His membership at the Morris County Country Club was quietly, permanently revoked. He is no longer welcome in the dining room, where Jessica once spilled coffee during the funeral repast. Speaking of the sister tainted by association and stripped of her boutique agency credentials following a state board review of the Stamford Commission, Jessica was forced to relocate out of state to find employment. The Walker family name, once a shield of aristocratic New Jersey privilege, became a toxic liability. Thomas sits in a downsized condominium, isolated, fielding calls from collection agencies instead of tea times. He engineered a shadow corporation to steal my wealth, and in doing so, he burned his own dynasty to the ground. I shift my gaze from the window back to my center monitor. The digital dashboards display my current wealth architecture. The columns are neat, organized, and transparent. The interface glows with reassuring stability. There are no phantom toll charges terminating 40 miles short of a destination. There are no hidden limited liability companies draining $4,200 on the 15th of every month. There are no fabricated escrow wires moving performance bonuses into secret real estate transactions. Every dollar is accounted for, tracked, and secure. The system operates with flawless integrity. For 8 years, I functioned as the primary revenue stream for a parasitic syndicate. I survived a comprehensive systemic betrayal not by weeping, bargaining, or seeking emotional closure, but by treating my family trauma exactly like a corporate crisis. I audited the threat, isolated the compromised sectors, weaponized the available data, and liquidated the corrupt subsidiaries. Many people believe trust is the most valuable asset in a partnership. They are mistaken. Trust is a vulnerability. Verification is the only currency that matters. I reach across the glass desktop. I pick up the limited edition gold Cartier pen. The smooth metal feels cool and solid against my skin. I trace the engraved barrel, acknowledging the instrument that inadvertently handed me the keys to my own freedom. I clip the writing instrument securely to the inner lapel of my tailored blazer. I close the laptop. The curved screens fade to black, plunging the office into a quiet, peaceful twilight. I stand up and walk toward the wooden blinds. I look out the window at the manicured suburban street. The evening air is still. The neighborhood rests in quiet domesticity. My house stands secure, a fortress built on verified data rather than fabricated affection. I take a slow, deep breath, letting the clean silence fill my lungs. The audit is closed. The ledger is finally balanced. When the dust settles on a story like Mackenzie Walker's, the immediate reaction is often a mixture of profound shock and deep, resonant satisfaction. We marvel at the clinical precision of the audit, the flawless execution of the corporate dissolution, and the poetic justice that rained down upon a syndicate of fraudsters. But when we step back from the adrenaline of the retaliation, a quieter, much darker question begins to surface. It is a question not about how a wife dismantles a parasitic marriage, but rather how a family creates a parasite in the first place. David was not born a fraudster. He was not born with the instinct to forge documents, siphon corporate bonuses, or maintain two separate realities. He was raised, molded, and meticulously engineered to become the man who sat in that glass-walled conference room and wept only for his own financial ruin. The true tragedy of the Walker family is not how their empire collapsed, but how it was built. It is a chilling case study in the catastrophic failure of family responsibility and a stark warning about the long-term consequences of misaligned parenting values in modern American culture. In the pursuit of the American dream, there is a dangerous temptation to prioritize the appearance of success over the foundation of character. Traditional family structures are meant to be incubators of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. They are supposed to be the safe harbors where children learn that actions have consequences, that partnerships require mutual respect, and that true wealth is not measured in offshore accounts or country club memberships, but in the integrity of one's word. Thomas and Evelyn Walker entirely abandoned that sacred responsibility. They confused protection with enablement, and in doing so, they destroyed their children. Consider Evelyn, the matriarch who secretly funded her son's mistress out of her own limited retirement pension. She likely rationalized her actions as maternal love. She convinced herself that she was protecting her secret grandchildren, shielding her son from the messiness of a divorce, and preserving the pristine image of her family in their wealthy New Jersey suburb. But maternal love without moral boundaries is not love. It is complicity. By funding David's deception, Evelyn taught him that he never had to face the reality of his own mistakes. She taught him that his comfort was more important than his wife's sanity, and that the truth was something you could simply buy your way out of. She removed the obstacle of accountability, and in doing so, she amputated his capacity for emotional growth. Then look at Thomas, the patriarch, the retired tax attorney who sat at the head of the dinner table, dispensing advice and projecting unwavering authority. A father's role is to guide his children toward fairness, to teach them how to navigate the complex moral landscapes of adulthood with honor. Instead, Thomas taught his son that rules are merely suggestions for people who cannot afford clever lawyers. He taught David that marriage is not a sacred equal partnership, but a host organism to be managed and extracted from. When David stumbled into a massive moral and financial deficit, Thomas did not sit his son down and tell him to confess. He did not counsel him to face the music with dignity. He unscrewed a Cartier pen and committed felony forgery. He weaponized his intellect to protect his son's entitlement. When you raise children in an ecosystem where success is defined by what you can get away with rather than what you earn, you do not raise strong adults. You raise fragile narcissists. You raise people like Jessica, who saw nothing wrong with pocketing a commission on a house bought with stolen money because the family culture dictated that wealth justified the means. You raise people like David, who can drink vintage champagne with the woman whose labor he is actively stealing without a single flicker of remorse. True parenting, the kind that builds resilient, honorable generations, requires the courage to let your children fail. It requires the emotional awareness to sit with your child when they make a devastating mistake and say, "I love you, but you are wrong, and you must make this right." In American culture, we are often pressured to curate perfect lives, to curate flawless college applications, to curate seamless marriages for the neighborhood to admire. We desperately want to shield our kids from pain, from judgment, and from consequence. But the insulation we provide often becomes the very thing that suffocates their moral compass. If Thomas and Evelyn had possessed the courage to value honesty over their social standing, they would have forced David to tell Mackenzie the truth years ago. It would have been painful. It would have been a scandal. It would have shattered the perfect facade. But it would have given David a chance to take responsibility for his life. It would have allowed Sarah to make an informed choice about her own future, rather than wasting 7 years believing in a phantom trust fund. And it would have treated Mackenzie as a human being deserving of agency, rather than a ledger to be balanced. Instead, the parents chose the lie. They chose to insulate their son, and the resulting pressure cooker eventually exploded, destroying everyone in its blast radius. The story of the Walker family is a mirror held up to the quiet, hidden corners of our own households. It asks us to examine the values we are quietly passing down around the kitchen table. Are we teaching our children how to manipulate the system, or are we teaching them how to stand upright within it? Are we demonstrating through our own marriages and partnerships that trust is a sacred currency, or are we showing them that loyalty is conditional? If you are finding yourself reflecting on the quiet dynamics of your own family, if this story resonated with the truth you have been hesitant to confront, or if you simply believe that accountability is the bedrock of a life well lived, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. We tell the stories that remind us all why boundaries matter, why truth eventually rises to the surface, and why the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the receipts. As you go about the rest of your day, look closely at the architecture of your own life. Look at the people you are raising, the partnerships you are maintaining, and the values you are compromising in the name of peace. Are you building a home on a foundation of verifiable truth? Or are you living in a beautifully decorated structure, waiting for the first strong wind to tear it down? Sometimes the most terrifying realization is not that the people we love are capable of profound deception. It is the lingering, quiet thought that if we are not careful with what we teach the next generation, the person sitting across from us at the dinner table might just be a stranger, waiting for the perfect moment to hand us the bill.